Good morning, Cameron.
Good morning.
Good morning, Alexa.
Good morning.
So just another reminder that you guys have that quiz that you need to do by Friday. A good chunk of everyone has already done that, so thank you for doing that. I've been grading them as I've been getting them turned in. Just remember that it's your last assignment before the final exam, so make sure to do your best on it. And it's in a very similar format to the final exam as well. The final exam is also multiple choice, some short essay, and one long essay question that you'll get next week ahead of time. And once again, next week we will be doing a review of your final exam, so make sure to come to those classes so that you get that information. And of course, I have been trying my best to remind you of things as we're going along that are probably going to be on your final. Well, they aren't probably, they are on your final. And of course, for those of you that still have not turned in your gallery report or that have been asked to add your citations, the last day to do that is today. So get those done and get those finished. And of course, yesterday we left off after talking about the fauves, or the wild beasts, known for their extreme uses of colors. The bridge group, known for creating a bridge between Germany's past and present, and the Blue Rider group, known for their use of, once again, color, as well as horses and riders, and particularly the color blue, as well as Cubism. Cubism is going to be popping up quite a bit today as well, because there's going to be a lot of other groups that follow that are going to be very influenced by Cubism. Just a reminder that there were two kinds of Cubism that we talked about yesterday. There's synthetic Cubism and analytical Cubism. Synthetic Cubism used mixed media, and analytical Cubism is trying to show an object from multiple viewpoints all at the same time. Today, we are going to pick up where we left off time-wise, as far as like linear time-wise, right at the end of World War I, and we will stop today at the beginning of World War II and art made in that time period. So we're going to be focusing on the first half of the 1900s today. Beginning with Dada art. We've already talked about Dada art before. If you remember Merritt Oppenheim's Fur Teacup, the fur-lined teacup from the very beginning of the semester, that is a work by Dada artists. Dada art began as a protest against World War I. World War I was the first war on a global scale. It scared a lot of people, and it was very hard and difficult for everyone to digest what was happening. Dada artists in particular were very frustrated by the lack of cooperation between world leaders, saying that the war probably could have been prevented and ended earlier had the world leaders just had discussions rather than fighting. The Dada artists wanted those peace agreements to happen, and they were frustrated that they weren't. And they couldn't understand why the peace agreements weren't happening. So Dada art is a reaction and an expression of those frustrations. They felt like World War I was an absurd war that could have been avoided. And they're trying to showcase that absurdity in their art, which is why most Dada art is very strange and dumb, because they felt the war was dumb. Dada ended up becoming a rallying cry for artists. The word itself had no connotation or meaning. It was made up. So there's no real reason for it. Once again, like they felt the war, there was no real reason for it. Some Dada artists took to the streets and started reading gibberish poetry on the sides of the street covered in tinfoil. So they'd make tinfoil hats and tinfoil outfits and stand on street corners and start shouting in an unknown language. And that was considered Dada poetry. Once again, trying to showcase the stupidity of the war through their actions. Most Dada artists are after shock value, once again, to get people to realize how stupid things are in the world at this point in time. And the main Dada artists are Marcel Duchamp, Hannah Höch, and Man Ray. We're going to be talking about those three primarily for the Dada artists today. Yesterday, we did finish off talking about Marcel Duchamp with the Nude Descending the Staircase #2, made using stroboscopic photography. Following that period of art, he goes into Dadaism, and he decides to create something called ready-mades. Ready-mades are objects that are already made. Get it? They're already made. So what Duchamp would do is he'd find random objects and put them on display in museums and galleries and call them art. Most art critics were very frustrated with this. But once again, Dada art is expressing frustration with the world climate at that moment. So it makes sense that the art itself is a bit frustrating and idiotic. Here we have an advance of a broken arm, because a shovel is like an extension of your arm when you're using it. This is not the original version of the shovel. The original version was accidentally thrown out because people thought it was like not art. But what Duchamp did is he actually just went to a local hardware store and bought a shovel and then put it on display. That's it. So nowadays we are on our 4th version of this shovel, and to replace it, all you have to do is go to a hardware store and try and find the. Here is another Duchamp ready-made. This is Fountain from 1917, and all it is a urinal that he found in a dumpster, and he picked up the urinal, wrote R. Mutt 1917 on the side, and put it on a pedestal in a gallery. The gallery was very furious with having a urinal on display for their art show that year. This is just a photograph of the, do not have the original. Once again, it was accidentally thrown away. Of course, another Duchamp ready-made. We have LHOOQ. For this particular ready-made, Duchamp went to the Louvre, purchased a postcard of the Mona Lisa, and on that postcard he drew a mustache, beard, and wrote LHOOQ on the card in pencil. LHOOQ translates in French, when you're saying it very quickly, to "she has a nice ass." Of course, you can't actually see Mona Lisa's butt, so once again, a bit playful and absurd. Other artists were equally inspired by Duchamp's ready-mades and decided to put their own spin on the concept, like Man Ray. Man Ray today is most well known for his photography, in which he would dress up as a woman. One of the first transgender photographers out there showcasing that. But this is one of his early works. This is called The Gift. And what it is an iron that has thumbtacks glued to it. It is obviously not a gift. If you were to receive this, you would probably not be happy because you'd have an unusable iron. If you used this, it would destroy your clothes. Once again, put it on a pedestal and showcase it at a museum. The original, once again, was lost. So this is a replica that was made in 1958. So once again, Dada art, absurd. It's trying to showcase the artist's feelings with the world climate during World War I. Our next Dada artist is Hannah Hawk. We've looked at her before with the cut with a kitchen knife and that really long title one from the beginning. It's like the one art piece that I can never remember the full title. It's like Weimar Veer Valley, blah, blah, blah. And Cultural Epic is in there somewhere too. It's like a 3-line long title. But here is her Multi-Millionaire. What Hannah Hawk does is photo montage in all of her works. All that is a combination of different photos that have been put together and assembled to create some sort of a collage. This is also a bit inspired by Cubism. So here you see the front profile of the man and the side profile of the man, obviously not the same man, but she was trying to pull from the concepts of Cubism and showing different viewpoints at the same time here with these men. And what this is depicting is a very rich man surrounded by all of his inventions of the time, trying to showcase the fact that a lot of these inventions and technologies really haven't helped society as far as World War I is concerned, because a lot of the technologies led to more death. That takes us into Surrealism. So Surrealism comes about following Dada art. It is also a bit absurd, but not in the sense of trying to showcase world frustrations, more in the sense of trying to understand our subconscious mind. Surrealism comes about in a time in which Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's theories were being published. Does anyone know who Freud is? What did he do? What's he known for? What is Sigmund Freud known for? Yeah, he has a lot of like writings about our early childhood development, draws upon our sexual attraction to our parents, and then later on our sexual attractions go back to that original attraction to our parents. And a lot of writings about the id and the ego and the superego being applied to that subconscious mind. Carl Jung did a lot of similar theories. So both of them were psychologists writing about subconscious. Jung himself specialized in dreams. Freud also wrote a few books about dreams and the meanings of dreams and how they can be interpreted and read. So we're going to next be looking at an artist group that is interested in trying to understand subconscious, and certain members are specifically focusing on dreams and the importance of dreams and trying to understand their own. But our early first two artists that we're going to be looking at are just trying to grasp their subconscious mind. They did have a manifesto. If you remember yesterday, we talked about what a manifesto is. It's just basically a motto or a goal that your group is trying to accomplish with your works. The writer of this manifesto was André Breton. He was one of the surrealist artists in the group. It was a rather large group, comprised of people like Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, André Breton, and Rene Magritte. Of course, Dali, the well-known one of that particular group for his oil paintings. So we have now moved past in time from World War I finally. After Dada and their absurdity, they continue on with that until the end of World War I and a little bit after World War I as well. And then eventually after Dadaism comes Surrealism in the 1920s. Our first surrealist artist is Max Ernst. This is the Horde, and it was made using something called frottage. So what frottage is, it's a rubbing. We've talked about rubbings before in the past. So you get a piece of paper and you lay it on top of like asphalt or concrete, something with texture on it, and you get a crayon and you rub the side of the crayon on it. What Max Ernst did after creating that rubbing is he would stare at that image for a very long time and try and pick out objects and make objects out of those little rubbing creatures. So what this actually is his little rubbing of an asphalt area that he made creatures out of, and then he painted those creatures on a large scale. In his mind, it's a bit similar to ink blot tests. Do you guys know what ink blot tests are? It's when you stare at a piece of paper with a blot of or a splash of ink on it and try and make an image out of it. And supposedly it says something about your subconscious mind. That's what he was using with this frottage method. He felt like whatever he was coming up with in staring at things said something about his subconscious or unconscious self. So here he has, in this particular example, created a horde of monsters that are battling each other. So perhaps this says something about his subconscious at that point in time being in a lot of turmoil or struggling with its own self. So yeah, this particular surrealist artist not interested in dreams so much as trying to grasp what's happening in his own brain at that point in time, and expressing his emotions subconsciously at that moment. The next artist, Salvador Dali, on the other hand, was solely interested in depicting his dreams. So right here, we have The Persistence of Memory, which is the painting that Dali is probably most well known for. And this is a painting which illustrates a dream that Dali had one night while he was asleep. And it shows on it melting clocks, a pocket watch covered with ants. This particular clock has a grasshopper on it, a random tree stump with another clock melting on it. This right here on the ground that people always get confused with is supposed to be an abstract self-portrait of Salvador Dali. You can kind of make out his eye right there. Some people always think it's like an ear or something. I'm like, dude, that's a hairy ear. And then in the background, we have a mountain and some water. There's no realization as to where exactly this is taking place. We do recognize some of the objects, but they're shown in a very odd, unusual manner and in an odd arrangement. That's once again to reference the fact that sometimes in dreams we see objects that are recognizable, but they don't always make sense to us. So this was him trying to remember that dream on paper that he had and jot it down before he forgets it and try to make some sense or semblance of that dream in relation to his mind at that point in time. So for him, perhaps this particular dream was about time wasting away, that he was wasting his time. But that's just one possibility as far as people have studied this particular painting. There's a lot of different theories as to what this dream might have meant originally. Of course, we've also talked about Dali and his films with the Andalusian Dog, which is another example of objects being shown with other objects that don't quite make sense together. Artist Juan Miro is working in a similar manner to Max Ernst by randomly trying to make objects appear out of other things, like an ink blot test, to try and understand what was happening in his mind at the time. However, the way he did it is called automatism instead of frottage. Automatism is when you get a random piece of paper or something and you go and make a bunch of squiggles, and then you try and make stuff out of those squiggles. That's automatism. So what Juan Miro did is he got a piece of paper and did a bunch of random lines and then stared at them long enough to where he could make objects appear out of it, just like an ink blot test again. And supposedly whatever he could come up with said something about his subconscious at that moment in time. Then he would go and paint it on a grand scale, just like Ernst did. So here we see that for this particular automatism adventure, Miro came up with woman haunted by the passage of the bird dragonfly, omen of bad news. So here we see over in the far left corner a woman screaming. She is being haunted by the dragonfly and the bad omen. So Miro has interpreted this particular example of automatism that perhaps something bad is about to happen in his life and he needs to be concerned and prepared for it. Of course, that is reading a lot into subconscious, and I don't know how much you agree with those theories, but hey, at this point in time, it was a pretty good trend. A lot of philosophers ended up taking on Freudian Jung's theories and spinning it their own way as well. And we actually see a good chunk of artists popping up around this time period that were very influenced by Freud's writings. In fact, artists today are still really interested in them. But the Surrealists had their very special way of interpreting those writings. Dali, of course, studying dreams, and Miro and Ernst trying to study their subconscious. Rene Magritte, on the other hand, is a bit of an odd duck as far as the Surrealist group. What Rene Magritte would do is show very recognizable objects in very odd ways, not trying to understand his subconscious, not trying to understand dreams. He's just putting two objects that don't make sense together. So here we see two lovers in an impossible kiss. So they can't really be lovers. They can't really kiss each other because of the fabric covering their head. Rene Magritte also has a bit of a sense of humor. If you remember the Treachery of Images, the one that says, "This is not a pipe," that was a Rene Magritte painting. He likes to have a bit of a chuckle with a lot of his artworks, which you can kind of see translated over here as well. Now, at this point in time, people are tired of basic cubism and they try to put their own spin on it. So we are going to be looking at several different variations of cubism, beginning with the Russian variation called suprematism. Suprematism works similarly to cubism in the fact that it's only using geometric forms. But with suprematism, it is not really trying to depict an actual object. It's just random geometric forms. It's fun. Suprematism is more focused on the power of those geometric shapes and the colors used than it is about depicting objects. Whereas cubism was very much concerned with depicting objects from several different viewpoints. Once again, suprematism develops in Russia. That's going to be important next week on your final, so you might want to put a little like asterisk next to that. Rene Magritte's also going to be on your final next week, so you might want to put a little asterisk next to him too. See, today you guys are lucky because last night with my night class, I did their final exam review, so it's very fresh on my brain right now. So our main suprematist artist is Kazimir Malevich. This is composition, well, suprematist composition, airplane flying. So this is supposed to be a depiction of an airplane, which you can kind of make out with the propeller, but obviously a very, very abstract airplane. And for this, he has just used very basic geometric, rectangular, and square shapes and primary colors. This is going to eventually lead into something called distill art later on, which only uses primary colors and geometric shapes as well. So we're going to, for a while now, witness a period of art that is very, very pared down, and could say that later on it influences the creation of minimalist art, which is as pared down as you can get. Sometimes for his works, Malevich, yes, that is supposed to say rectangles, not whatever the heck I just wrote there. Sometimes he would get random pieces of construction paper and cut them up into rectangles and squares and kind of set them and play with their arrangement. And then he would go and copy that arrangement onto his paintings. So if it looks like it's just construction paper pieces on a painting, that would be why. The previous one as well. So just bits of construction paper that he'd cut up to arrange before he actually painted his composition. Once again, Malevich and the Suprematists were very interested in shapes and colors and how powerful those shapes and colors can be. Today in modern sculpture, a lot of artists are trying to delve into why certain shapes are so recognizable for us. For example, an onion dome from the Taj Mahal. Why do we instantly recognize these shapes? How are they so powerful in our brain? And I feel like that really begins around this time period with these artists that are starting off playing with the idea of basic shapes. Another artist that is not a suprematist artist that is inspired by Cubism but in a different way is Ferdinand Léger. Léger is working in Italy, and like the Cubists, he's trying to use very geometric shapes to illustrate, but unlike the Cubists, he is not trying to illustrate them from multiple viewpoints, and he is using color. But still, we see a collage of very basic shapes along with really bright colors. And for this, we just see an illustration of a city with some people. Here you can see the crosswalk with people on it, a road. Of course, things are arranged to make it a bit more complicated to read, just like analytical cubism. It's not like laid out the way an actual city looks. He's like taken bits and pieces of the cityscape and arranged it in almost a collage-like format. The painting Léger is most well known for is Three Women, which is seen here. It's kind of reminiscent to Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is another portrayal of nude women lounging around. But here we see instead of using triangles and squares, Léger has used a good chunk of circular forms and rounder forms to portray these women. Léger also, for a brief period of time, dabbled in film. Of course, these are artistic films. We're not going to watch the clip today because I don't like listening to sirens early in the morning, because that is the soundtrack. It's a bunch of sirens, like ambulance sirens, as well as things breaking. It's a little early for that. It's loud. But the clips itself, he used a lot of kaleidoscope images. So he inserted a camera lens into a kaleidoscope and spun it around. And if you're familiar with kaleidoscopes, they use a lot of geometric shapes to show colors and things changing. So a good chunk of the film is based on that, as well as going back to those loud noises and showing the loud noises, and a very odd close-up of a woman's smile. Like literally all you see is just her smile. It's an odd film, it's an artistic film, and it kind of plays on his use of patterns and shapes here in his paintings. And of course, Russia and suprematism eventually will evolve into constructivism. comes about when the Soviet Union is born. So when the Soviet Union begins, suprematism switches to constructivism. They're very similar in the fact that they are both using geometric shapes and the power of shapes and basic colors, but it's a little bit more than just rectangles and squares, which we saw with suprematism. There's a bit more to it. Constructivism can primarily be seen in early Soviet Union advertisements and billboards. They would use really, really bright colors and bold wording to try and capture people's attention. And it's also seen in architecture and home decor as a means of trying to elicit a better workforce and more productivity in your life. So constructivism, like I said, similar to suprematism in the sense that we're still using geometric shapes and basic colors. But as you can see, it's a little bit more advanced than just putting pieces of construction paper on a table and playing with the layouts. Here, Popova has created painterly architectonic by making it appear that different shapes are intersecting with other shapes in the painting. And once again, like I said, constructivism uses very, very bright, bold, solid blocks of color. In fact, I should really pull up an advertisement because that's like quintessential constructivism. So constructivism, like I said, is mostly seen in advertising during this era. So advertising such as this, very bright colors and basic geometric shapes are used, as well as bold lettering. And this is all just to celebrate communism is what most of these advertisements are about, and showing the perks of communism and socialism. And as I said earlier, most constructivist art is seen in advertising and decor. The decor examples of constructivism usually try to elicit productivity in the owners. So here we see a view of the Workers' Club. This was made for the World's Fair in 1925. This is a reconstruction of that particular World's Fair. This was created by Alexander Rodchenko. And the way this particular Workers' Club was supposed to be, if you notice, those seats have a very tall back with high armrests. That is to try and get you to have proper posture, because studies have shown if you have proper posture, you'll be a little bit more productive in your work. That makes sense. I wouldn't want to sit like that, though. That doesn't seem very comfortable, but it's not about comfort, it's about productivity. And if you're not familiar with communist Russia, it's all about the greater good of the country. So you are supposed to be productive for the greater good of everyone, not just for yourself. So it's very different from our capitalist society, in which we are usually more concerned with our own personal being than we are the entire country. But here we see constructivism. Once again, very basic linear shapes being used. This was not painted at all. It would have just been bare wood. So you don't have your bright colors like you did for this one, but still very basic shapes. And that takes us to De Stijl. De Stijl also uses very basic shapes, but it's not in Russia. This one is in the Deutschland. In Amsterdam. It was created by an artist named Piet Mondrian. He's going to be on your test. Maybe put an asterisk. So Piet Mondrian creates De Stijl because he is trying to create the style that will end all styles. He doesn't think there's going to be another art style to come after this. Boy, was he wrong, because we still have 2 more chapters left to go over. So De Stijl literally translates to the style in English. And it was a group of Dutch artists that were inspired by Cubism and worked in a very similar manner to Suprematism by just using basic geometric shapes and primary colors. So they only used straight, horizontal, and vertical lines in black and square and rectangular blocks of solid primary colors. It was used in painting, home decor, and architecture, and clothing, if you're familiar with that clothing style. Originally, Piet Mondrian did not start in the de Stijl style. He started off in an Impressionist style, and eventually he worked his way at trying his hand in Cubism, and he ends up working his way to de Stijl. De Stijl is this. So it's just black vertical and horizontal lines and blocks of solid color. In order to create these paintings, he actually used painter's tape and would lay down the painter's tape to get those perfect lines and then use that as a guide to make his lines. On some of his paintings, he still has the painter's tape, which is how we know he used painter's tape to do it, if he didn't take it off. Like I said, de Stijl will be used in architecture. We'll be coming across it in a second. But in architecture, the primary thing that's happening in Europe at this point in time is the international style. We've talked about this one a few times before. It's basically your glass and steel boxed buildings like skyscrapers with lots of windows and primarily being held up with steel beams. The artists were inspired by those constructivists and suprematists as well as de Stijl artists to create those box-like structures. If you remember, all three of those particular art styles have one thing in common, and that is their use of geometry and geometric shapes. So it makes sense that the architectural style is also very box and cube-like. They're also inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright, who's an American architect that invented the cantilevered roof. And that's the primary thing that they take out of that. International style originated in Germany, France, and the Netherlands simultaneously, so no one particular country can lay claim to it. And it ended up becoming popular worldwide. These particular houses stood out from their surroundings due to the architectural designs, as opposed to Frank Lloyd Wright's, whose homes were the prairie house style homes that are just one level story houses and very basic, and primarily what we see here in West Texas. One such example of the international style is Garrett Reitfeld's Schroeder House. This particular house is done in the de Stijl style as well, meaning that it uses vertical and horizontal lines and primary colors, both on the inside and the outside. I'm pretty sure you can probably see it from the outside. It is a rectangular box. And this particular house is really interesting because every single inch of the house is not wasted space. The walls move to create new floor plans. You can move your floor plans and rearrange your walls. And the really interesting thing about this particular house is this window right here. So this window has a piece of glass butted up against another piece of glass right here. It looks like there's an iron beam in the middle, but there's not actually. That's part of another section. So he has two windows going up against each other, and you can actually open those windows. This is like the one few examples in architecture in which we have two windows against each other with no support in between. But that's because he's added supports in different areas to help that. The interior of the house, there's that window, by the way. So you can see really clearly here, there's no internal support between those two windows. Interior here, you can see the slats on the floor that you can use to move the walls. They're like folding accordion style walls. So you can have a closed floor plan or an open floor plan with this house. This is the second floor. And of course, you can pull down a ladder and go up to the roof as well. So inside you can see once again a lot of horizontal vertical lines and uses of primary blocks of color. So the entire interior as well as the furniture used is made using the dish steel style as a reference as well. And that takes us to politics in art. So we kind of already saw politics in art with Dadaism as well as constructivism in Russia during the Soviet Union, but we see it in other areas popping up around this time as well. For example, Italy, Mexico, the United States, and of course Russia will have their fair share of art made with politics in mind. Some art is made as a protest to fascism and dictatorships that are popping up in the world. It's around this point in time that we see the birth of Hitler's Germany as well as Mussolini's Italy. So we do see those protests popping up in art as a theme. But we also see art coming about that is in support of some of these governments. Here we see Picasso's protest against the Spanish president at the time with Guernica. So I'm sure probably by now, after writing a bunch of papers and reading stuff, you're familiar with the story. But Guernica has a very sad story. For this painting, Picasso read a very small newspaper clipping section about his home country of Spain. And the story stated that the Spanish president, because he was trying to get on good terms with Hitler, allowed for the bombing of the small town of Guernica. It was a practice bombing. The people were not notified, so they were still there living. They didn't know it was going to happen. And the practice bombings ended up resulting in the death of the entire village of Guernica. And it was kind of swept under the rug. At that same point in time, right after Picasso read about this, the Spanish president went to Picasso and asked Picasso to paint something for the upcoming World's Fair. And for his painting, Picasso decided to make Guernica, which is a very large painting, as a protest against that particular Spanish president. Of course, the Spanish president was furious and told Picasso if he ever came back to Spain, he would be thrown in jail for the rest of his life. Eventually, that Spanish president is going to be run out of Spain. We're going to learn about that one tomorrow. In another artist's interpretation of political affairs, we're going to see the end of that story. But for this particular painting, we see early hearkenings to the beginnings of Cubism with basic geometric forms and some abstract interpretations. But the reason why this painting is done in black, gray, and white is because Picasso read about the event in the newspaper, which is black and gray. So that'd be why it is in this format and not in color. The light bulb here is a reference to God's all-seeing eye, stating that even though Spain tried to sweep it under the rug, God still witnessed it, and he knows what happens. And of course, you can see all of the people screaming in agony as well as the livestock as they are dying in that bombing. Now, another example of politics in art is social realism, but it's quite a bit different depending on which country you're going to. So social realism became very popular in several different countries, and it does have to do with politics depending on which country you're talking about. It has a different thing to do with politics. For example, social realism in the United States showcased America's strength and beauty, but social realism in Mexico celebrated communism, and social realism in Russia also celebrated communism. So there's a bit of a political undernote with a lot of social realist works. But most social realism exists to communicate some sort of a theme or a message to society and the people living in that country. So it is not abstract, it is realistic. We're taking a very brief break from abstract art for a moment. And our first example of social realism is from Russia. So of course, the main message going on in this one for, well, the USSR at this point in time, it's not Russia, it's the Soviet Union at this point in history. The main message they're trying to get across is the celebration of socialism or communism here. So here we see Monument to the Proletariat and Agriculture by Vera Mukina. For this particular, it's a huge statue. Mukina submitted her idea to the government, and she was chosen out of a bunch of other submissions to create her artwork. So a rare example of a female artist gaining a great honor in a country. By the way, the Popova artist that we looked at earlier is another female artist. So it's kind of interesting to note that the only female artists, well, the good chunk of the female artists that we're going to talk about today are from Russia, not from anywhere else. But here for this statue, we have a celebration of communism. Particularly, you can see that in the hammer and sickle, which is on the communist flag. That is basically their symbol. The hammer is, of course, for creating things and manufacturing. So that would be on your factory end. And the sickle is representative of the agriculture being produced in that country. So you have your factory and your agriculture both being represented in that, which is the main reason why that is your communist symbol. And of course, here you see a man and a woman standing on equal footing, working together at the same time. Socialism itself is all about everyone having equal standing in society and working together as a whole to try and achieve productivity and a strong country. So it's all about working together, sameness, equality. There's not supposed to be a division between classes or sexes in true socialism. So that is what Vera Mukina has illustrated in this statue. Of course, the statue itself is no longer on display after communism ended. It was taken down and it is now stored in a very large airplane hangar. But that is a wonderful example of social realism. Of course, the main message that is trying to get across to the people is the celebration of socialism or communism. Here we have another celebration of socialism, but it's not quite as obvious as Vera Mukina's. This is Diego Rivera's The Liberation of the Peon. This is a fresco. Once again, if you remember, we talked about Diego Rivera quite a bit when we were going over frescoes, since that is what he does. But here we see a group of people in Mexico that have just liberated this slave from his slave owner. In the background, you see the owner's residence. They have set on fire and destroyed it. This is Rivera's attempt at trying to spread socialism into Mexico. He very strongly felt like it was a better government system because there was equality. There wasn't things like slavery in socialism because there wasn't supposed to be that class division. So this is him basically making a statement and sending a message to people that if we switch to communism, there won't be this division in our society between the lower class and the upper class. So we should switch. And that was his attempt to do so. The message in this one, like I said, is not quite as obvious as this particular example. Social realism is also happening in the United States, but it's very different. We aren't going to be trying to spread communism. Instead, we're trying to illustrate what is happening in our society and spread that information to the rest of the country. Sometimes it's celebrating America, sometimes it's just educating America. And that's what this particular photograph is trying to do here. Dorothea Lange was part of the Works Progress Association, which was a department that was set up during the Great Depression by the president to try and provide jobs for artists. So artists were hired by the government to go around and try to take pictures and paint images that illustrated America at that point in time. And Dorothea Lange went into the Dust Bowl region and took photographs of the people that were experiencing those strifes and sent those off to the newspapers for them to publish and educate people that weren't living in that area as to what was happening. And of course, she ended up being paid by the Works Progress Association for that work. Meanwhile, art from Latin America that is not by Diego Rivera, which we haven't really talked about much else other than that. Latin American artists, unlike American artists or United States artists, are trying to infuse European influence into their art styles. Remember, the US is still sticking with landscapes and boring stuff. Latin American artists have moved past that. They're trying to combine the European art trends and art styles with their own flair and heritage. And that is because a good chunk of the Latin American artists that are really well known from this time period went to school in Europe. So it makes sense that they were pretty influenced by European art since they went to art school there. And here we see our first example of a Latin American artist. This is Amaral Aburto. For this, we see he has used a very large abstract form of a human. Abstract art, obviously very prevalent in Europe. We've seen quite a few examples of it already. This one does not use sharp geometric forms like a lot of the European art, though. This uses very round forms and smoother forms and more naturalistic depictions. Naturalistic was not the right word. I should have used organic. That would have been a better word. And of course, here in the background, we have the cactus and the slice of citrus fruit in the sun. So for this, Amaral has combined his teachings from European art school with traditional painting styles and imagery found in Latin America at that time. Latin Americans used a lot more like natural organic forms in their illustrations versus sharp geometric shapes. And of course, the cactus and the citrus fruit harkens to things that you would find in Latin America versus Europe. Another example of a Latin American artist very influenced by European art is Zul Soler. He changed his name to Zul Soler because he was very invested in the sun. So both of those names have to do with sun, if you're familiar. And this is Dragon. So for this particular painting, we see once again, this is a bit surrealist in its depiction. It's very similar to the works of Juan Miro and Max Ernst and Dali in depicting a image that has recognizable objects but shown in a way that doesn't really make sense. So here we have the moon and the sun, as well as the night sky with comets and stars in the background, and below the ocean. And here we see the dragon with one of the Latin American ancient gods riding its back. The sun god is riding its back. And then, of course, all surrounding it are all of these different country flags, including the United States, British, France, and Germany. So a lot of European flags. The reason why all of those flags are there is to represent the countries in which Jules Soler went to and studied in for his art, to try and create his own style. So he's paying homage to all of those different countries. But of course, he is still sticking with his natural roots with the depiction of his ancient sun god here. And of course, the dragon. Dragon is a popular motif with the Mayan and Aztec people as well. And if you're wondering why there is a cross, a Jewish star, and an Islamic symbol here, that is because Jules Soler was trying his best. His main goal in life was to try to get those three religions to get along. Obviously, that has not happened yet. But he felt like they should be able to get along and just coexist together, because they really aren't all that different, and they really aren't all that different. We have a lot of similarities between all three, and that's the reason why he wanted them all to coexist and stop fighting with each other. And of course, probably the most prominent Latin American artist that we're talking about today is Frida Kahlo. I'm pretty sure everyone knows her. But here we see her painting the two Fridas. So Frida Kahlo lived a very depressing life. When she was younger, she was in a car accident that left her with a lot of complications. And she had to have many, many surgeries to try to fix those complications. A lot of her life was spent bedridden, just because of the pain and having to frequently go through those surgeries. She was very frustrated because she couldn't have children. They had to remove her ovaries after the accident, and that made her angry. She was married to Diego Rivera, who would constantly cheat on her, and she felt like it was her fault because she couldn't have kids and she was constantly bedridden. Of course, today we are smart enough to know that he's just a jerk. But here we see not so much her frustration with her body, well, kind of her frustration with her body, but more a frustration with her identity being depicted. So Frida is half Mexican American, well, not half Mexican American, she's half Mexican and half European in her ancestry, and she always felt an internal struggle as to who she was supposed to identify with. Was she supposed to be Mexican Frida, or was she supposed to be European Frida? How was she supposed to portray herself to society, to fit in? What was she supposed to do? So this right here is a depiction of that internal struggle happening, that she is these two things. They are united, they are the same. You can see them connected here with the veins. One can't live without the other. But at the same time, they are separate because she doesn't know who she's supposed to be. And there's also a little bit of a reference to her issues with her body here as she's bleeding out at the end. Takes us to what's going on in America. Well, America at this point in time is really well known for American regionalism. This is going to be on your test, by the way, so you might want to put an asterisk next to it. But American regionalism developed during the Great Depression as a way for artists to show what life was like in America. Most of them chose to portray America in a very positive, overly enthusiastic way. I would say it's ungenuine as to what America was going through during the Great Depression. But other artists did depict how America actually was and kind of still is today for people living in it. But most of them depicted it as a way of showing the great American dream and the providence of America. But the first example doesn't. The first example shows the loneliness of American society. This is a particular style that only exists in America. It does show realism, so we are not using abstract art at all. Things are very realistic. And our first American regionalist artist is Edward Hopper and Nighthawks. I hate this painting because everyone knows it, and it's constantly memed, and everyone writes about it, and I'm sick of it. I feel that same way about Starry Night and the Mona Lisa, but that's just me. I get tired of like people focusing on those major artworks to the point that I'm sick of them. Kind of like by the end of Thanksgiving, I'm sick of pumpkin pie because I've had it too much. But here we see Edward Hopper, instead of showing the majesty of America, which, like I said, is the primary topic of American regionalism, he has instead showcased the loneliness that one often experiences when you are living in America. So here we see this one man by himself off in the shadows. He is representative of that lonely feeling. And then over in the light, we see the couple and the man and the soda shop manager talking to them. Takes us to our next American regionalist artist. This is Grant Wood in American Gothic, another one that I'm kind of tired of just because everyone always focuses on it. I do like American regionalism, but not these two particular examples. But here we see Grant Wood has depicted his sister and his dentist. That's the other thing. It's kind of a disillusionment when you realize that it's just his dentist and his sister. They weren't married. They weren't a couple. Everyone always thinks they're a couple. In fact, in the final exam, even though I say this, someone will probably still say it's a married couple, even though it's not. It's just his dentist and his sister. And the reason why it is called American Gothic is because of the Gothic window in the background. So this is an American style home adorned with a Gothic window. That's literally why it's called American Gothic. The carpenter added that Gothic window afterwards, and Grant Wood was trying to capture that combination of Gothic architecture and American architecture at that time in a painting. So a merging of those two worlds. Another fun note, these guys are dressed in what looks like Puritan garb, even though we're in 1930 at this point, and Puritans have long since died out, but America is really well known for their Pilgrims and Puritans. And of course, I love the fact that Grant Wood has echoed the pitchfork design in the dentist's overalls and shirt. That's just a fun little add-on. A fun little side note with American regionalism is a lot of times, if you pay attention to the trees in the background, they all are in this very round cotton ball-like shape. That's very prevalent in American regionalist art, a bit cartoonish. Our last American regionalist artist is Thomas Hart Benton, and this is Achilles and Hercules. This is different from the one in your book. The one in your book is very interesting because of the way it chooses to portray American colonization. It can be a bit offensive as far as a painting go. So if you're interested in looking at that and you're interested in offensive art, I would recommend it. Thomas Hart Benton was very good friends with the president at that time. They grew up together. So Benton ended up making a living out of that Works Progress Association group by painting large murals and frescoes celebrating America and trying to make America look very grand. And that is exactly what he has done with Achilles and Hercules. Obviously, this was painted after World War II, so American regionalism does continue on after World War II, but it is not quite as prevalent. Eventually, we will switch to contemporary art thanks to the influx of European artists, but some continue on with that. And for this painting, Benton has associated America with Greek mythology. Here we see the strong American man wrestling the bull That is supposed to reference Hercules wrestling with the Minotaur bull from mythology. So the American man is representing Hercules there. Of course, these other men are getting ready to rope him off. In the foreground, you see lumber being cut. That is to celebrate America's lumber industry and the large amount of money that we make off of our lumber industry because we have so many trees available to us. Over here, you see the women with the laurel wreath. Laurel wreaths are another thing from ancient, handed out to Olympic athletes who won their particular event. So these women are about to award these men their laurel wreaths because they're heroes. If you notice, they're all sitting on top of a cornucopia. Cornucopias are a symbol of abundance of food. They're oftentimes seen at Thanksgiving time when there's a lot of food available. And this particular cornucopia is filled with food and grain, once again celebrating America's abundance. Over here, we see a man using a sickle, or not a sickle, but it's just his hands. He's picking corn once again. America very known for their corn. In the background, you see a steamboat celebrating America's technologies at that point in time. And of course, the African American thrown in at the very end off to the side to depict that we do have other people groups here, but they are not equal. As you can see, he is off by himself. He is not equal to the others. And that takes us to African American art, which is very different from Thomas Hart Benton's depiction of the African American. African American art at this point in time was going through something called the Harlem Renaissance. That's going to be on your test too, because for some reason I really loved the Harlem Renaissance in art. So does anyone know what the Harlem Renaissance is? Mm-hmm. Yes, very good. So there was a large influx of African Americans moving to the cities during the Harlem Renaissance, and they would live in areas like Harlem, which is why it has its name, together in a community. And in that community, they would celebrate their heritage and come up with new ideas. This is primarily brought about thanks to Alan Locke's The New Negro, which was published in 1925, and that urges African Americans to go back to their African roots as far as gaining inspiration for arts, music, and literature. Out of the Harlem Renaissance, we have a large amount of literary icons like Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson, and also the invention of jazz music. A lot of really amazing painters and sculptors as well. And our first example of artworks to come about from the Harlem Renaissance is Sergeant Johnson's Forever Free, which is a celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended slavery. Well, it didn't really end slavery. It said all of the slaves in the southern United States were free, but technically at that point in time, the southern United States was not the United States. It was the Confederate States of America. But that's just a little random fact that you don't really need to know. So here we see a mother holding her two children very tightly to her. That's also representative of the fact that when slavery was happening, oftentimes families were separated from each other. And now, because everyone is free, that will no longer be occurring. They are forever free. And of course, the big one, Jacob Lawrence, he created a series about the General Toussaint L'Ouverture. This is just one image from that series. which the entire series is done with gouache on paper. He also does a bit of collage in the series of works. But this particular image celebrates General Toussaint, who was a, Ryan, I'm gonna mute you really fast because we're getting feedback. I think it was Ryan or Ryan. It might not have been Ryan. Whoever's unmuted, can you mute? Because we're getting feedback over here. So General Toussaint L'Ouverture was a Haitian general. So Haiti was a little bit different with their slavery than like America. In Haiti, they had the free white people, the free black people, and the enslaved black people. And they had the free black people manage the enslaved black people because that's a good idea. General Toussaint happened to be one of those free blacks, and he decided one day to arm all of the enslaved blacks and go around and kill all of the white slave owners, causing a Haitian revolution and ending slavery in Haiti. Because France just gave up on trying to win it back afterwards. France were the owners of Haiti at that point in time. So this is a celebration of that particular general who armed all of the blacks and convinced them all to have a revolution and gain their freedom. And of course, the Haitian Revolution happens before the the Civil War. So it kind of inspires a lot of African Americans to hope for freedom as well during that time. Of course, this series was made a long time after that. That takes us to the very, very last thing today, which is organic abstraction. This is in application to sculptures. So in sculptures, a particular trend called organic abstraction comes about. And organic abstraction is opposed to any sort of art rules at all. It's trying to be extremely abstract in the way it depicts objects, but to make them look like they are organic life forms, even though it's not representational of anything. Abstraction at this point in history becomes a way for people to oppose traditional art style formats, and we're going to be seeing a large amount of abstraction from here on out. Organic abstraction was happening all over the world, and it had no particular nationality attributed to it. And our example of organic abstraction is Henry Moore's recumbent figure. So you can see it's in an extremely abstract format, but it refers to a organic life form. Any guesses as to what it's referring to? Here's head and its body. A human, yes, a female human in particular. So for this particular recumbent figure, which just refers to a reclining figure, so this is just another example of a reclining nude in art history. But for this, he gained inspiration from the Chuck Moule. If you remember when we were going over non-Western art, the Chuck Moule was from ancient Latin America, and it was that vessel with the bowl for a stomach used for sacrificial offerings. So here he has once again left a bowl in the center. Of course, this bowl can't hold anything like sacrifices, but it is referencing that same format there. course, our last organic abstraction example, this one is forms and echelon. For this work, Barbara Hepworth did not try to reference anything at all. This is completely non-representational, but it does look like an organic life form of some sort, like it should be something, even though it's not. Also, to add to that, she has used a very organic medium of wood to illustrate her message, which is just organic abstraction. Today, we did a lot. We did art between the wars. Actually, we didn't really do a lot. It was only about 20 years worth of time. But there's a lot happening in the world of art at that period of time. And we're going to see that continuing on for the rest of this course. Unfortunately, there's a lot more isms left. And tomorrow we are going to be going over post-World War II contemporary art. Contemporary art gets its title because it comes post-1945 is anything that's called contemporary. So be ready for that. Also tomorrow, to start off, very first 5 minutes of class, we will be going over the information that you need to answer your long essay question, because it comes from the very first 5 minutes of this presentation. So do not be late tomorrow, or else you will miss the information that you need to answer your long essay question on your final exam. Or be late and miss it. It's your call. Do it. I don't care. Not my grade. But one final thing before you guys leave, some of you need to check your inbox because I've sent you messages, so make sure to do that. And the survey for the course has opened up for you to do. It is in your Canvas over on your little tabs page on the left-hand side. Doing that survey helps your professors out a lot. It tells us what we need to do to make the coursework better. And since this is our first HyFlex example, it's a bit of a different course than what I would normally teach. Usually we do a lot of activities. So if you have suggestions, ideas, feedback, that's really helpful for me as we go forward in this new school life for the rest of the year. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. That survey is open until Friday. And of course, you guys have that quiz to do as well on Friday. You guys are free to go. I will see you all tomorrow for that post-World War II lesson. Have a wonderful day, guys.
The only article we have to get that. Google Docs is free. It's in your little
It is, if you go to Google, it's right in your waffle here.
Okay.
You just have to go to Google and
Move it up.
go down
I think
to,
you passed
yeah, I did, Docs.
Okay, cool.
And it's free for
I've
you
used
to
it
use,
before.
yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank
And
you.
you can submit that through Canvas.
All right, cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
Grace, you good?
Yep.
Okay, just checking.